Guard and reserves. One of those recommendations was to equip and resource the Guard and Reserve components as an operational reserve, rather than the Cold War model of a strategic reserve. The previous strategic reserve model assumed very few mobilizations and assumed risk with inadequate equipment strategies. The change to an operational reserve status coincident with a reorganization of the Army has greatly increased the amount of equipment Guard and Reserve units are required to have. The Department is making improvements and progress in providing adequate funding to equip the National Guard and Reserve components to enhance its role as an operational reserve. Sustaining this funding and having the necessary transparency and accountability of the equipment, however, continues to be a major challenge. The purpose of today's hearing is to get an assessment of the equipment and modernization needs of the Army National Guard, Air National Guard, Army Reserve, and Air Force Reserve. We also expect to learn of the improvements that have been made in managing the Guard and Reserve equipping process. While most Guard and Reserve units deployed overseas have all the equipment they require, many of those units don't get all that equipment until just before deployment, and in some cases after they deploy, which makes training to deploy very difficult. Aging equipment is also an area of critical concern. For example, Air National Guard aircraft are on the average 28 years old, with the KC-135 tankers averaging 49 years old. The Air National Guard is reporting a $7 billion shortfall in modernization funding. Congress has not hesitated in trying to address the equipment readiness shortfalls we have noted in many Guard and Reserve units. National Guard and Reserve component procurement from fiscal year 2004 to fiscal year 2010 has totaled approximately $42.1 billion, averaging almost $6 billion per year. Since 2004, Congress has authorized approximately $7.4 billion in a National Guard and Reserve equipment account. This funding has enjoyed sustained bipartisan support, both on this committee and throughout the Congress. Although substantial progress has been made in terms of adequate funding and reorganization, there is much more to be done. Shortfalls still exist. Before we begin, I would like to turn to my good friend and colleague from Texas, Sylvester Reyes, for his remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And today's hearing, I know, will cover a vital element of our armed forces, the reserve components of the Army and the Air Force. And I would like to add my welcome and thanks for your service, gentlemen. Thank you for being here. Back in 2006, there was a lot of debate about mobilizing large numbers of reserve soldiers and airmen for the war in Iraq. Today, we don't hear as much about this particular issue. In large part, I think, because using the Guard and Reserve to support active duty Army and Air Force has become a routine way of doing business. Since September 11th of 2001, hundreds of thousands of Army and Air Force reservists have deployed to combat. Tens of thousands are deployed today, with more in the pipeline to replace them. As the Chairman has pointed out, this change from a strategic reserve to an operational reserve is a major shift in U.S. military policy, with major impacts on equipment needs. Of course, this isn't a new issue for this subcommittee, which has strongly supported additional funding for Army and Air Force Reserve component needs. In fact, this subcommittee has led the way each year in pushing for additional equipment and its funding for the Guard and Reserve. These efforts have made a big impact in terms of both quality and quantity of equipment for the Guard and Reserve. So much progress has been made in getting the Guard and Reserve the modern equipment they need, but there is still much more work that remains to be done. Today's hearing will hopefully answer some questions about where the reserve components of the Army and Air Force are headed in the future. For example, how will we modernize the Air National Guard's fighter aircraft fleet, given the delays in the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter? How will the Army's new rotational readiness model impact the equipment sets for the Army National Guard and the Army Reserve? If the Army National Guard and Army Reserves are indeed operational as reserves, should they have the same quality equipment as the active Army? And finally, as the DoD looks to save money but maintain a maximum capability, should we consider increasing the size of the Army and Air Force Reserve elements as one way to get more bang for the buck in tight budget times? The answers to these and other questions will have a major impact on the future of the reserve components. So today, we look forward to hearing more about these issues. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
Thank you very much. We will proceed with the panel's testimony and then go into questions. Without objection, all witnesses' prepared statements will be included in the hearing record. General Stultz, please proceed with your opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Bartlett, Mr. Reyes, Mr. Labando, Mr. Wilson. It's an honor to be here today in front of you for this testimony. I'm here representing 206,000 Army Reserve soldiers around the world. And I placed in front of you a chart that shows the end strength of the Army Reserve and where it's been and where it is today. And I did that to illustrate one point. If you go back to the period of fiscal year 02-03, you'll see that the Army Reserve was way over strength, and we went from that period down to 06 time frame to almost 20,000 under strength.
What order are they saying?
Today, and I can set it up here, it's this chart. Today, we're back to about 206,000, we're being authorized 205,000. Now, the only reason I want to show you this chart is that was the old strategic reserve on your left-hand side. That is the operational reserve on the right-hand side. That's where we've been. That's where we are. And today, I can report to you that your Army Reserve is the best manned, best equipped, and best trained Army Reserve we've ever had. And I continue to be in awe as I travel around the world to see soldiers in Iraq, Afghanistan, Africa, Germany, Asia, places like that, Kosovo, that are well educated. They've got good civilian careers. They've got families. They've got nice homes. And they still raise their hand and take an oath to serve their nation, knowing that we're going to ask them to go in harm's way and risk their lives. And they do it because they love their country. And they do it because they feel their service. And they do it because they think, as they should, that we're going to provide them the right resources, the right equipment, and the right training that they need. And that we're going to take care of them and their families when they come home. So while we've got this great operational reserve, sir, that is a huge return on investment, just as Mr. Reyes said, when you're talking about our total military, the only way we're going to keep it is if we keep providing the equipment, the training, and the resources that those soldiers deserve. Because they're combat veterans now. They know what it's like to go and fight for their country. And they're going to expect us to provide them that same level of equipment and same level of training back home to maintain that combat edge. And so today, I hope that's what we get the opportunity to talk about. Because that's what my soldiers want. Because if we don't, we'll repeat that dip again. We'll go back through that same. And we cannot, as a nation, afford that. We've built too good of an operational reserve to let it go back the other way. So, sir, on behalf of those 206,000, thank you for the support that your committee and Congress has given us. And thank you for the support you will continue to give us in the future. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, sir. Be assured that we appreciate the contribution of our Guard and Reserve. They're maintained at a fraction of the cost of the regular military. We clearly cannot fight without them, because there's no way a 19-year-old can have the skill sets and the experience of a 39-year-old. And so we recognize the contribution that you bring, and we are concerned that the Guard and Reserve are not always as well equipped, and therefore do not have the opportunity for the kind of training the regular military has, and we want to correct that deficiency. Thank you very much for your testimony. Now, General Stenner.
Chairman Bartlett, Congressman Reyes, committee members, and fellow service members, I very much appreciate you allowing me the opportunity to be with you, to have this constructive conversation regarding one of the most important parts of my job, ensuring over 70,000 citizen airmen making up the Air Force Reserve have the resources and training essential to maintaining that most important readiness that we have today. I'd like to first, if I could, take the opportunity to introduce Chief Master Sergeant Dwight Badgett. As the Air Force Reserve Command Chief, Chief Badgett serves as my senior enlisted advisor, helping me keep track of the issues regarding the welfare, readiness, morale, proper utilization, and progress of this command's outstanding airmen. And thank you for being here today, Chief. My written testimony outlines our priorities, but briefly, I'd like to mention the fact that reservists continue to play an increasing role in ongoing global operations. They support our nation's needs, providing operational capabilities around the world. As we speak, Air Force reservists are serving in every combatant command area of responsibility. There are approximately 4,300 Air Force reservists currently activated to support missions around the globe. That number includes our force's contribution to the Japanese relief effort and direct support to the operations in Libya. Despite increased operations tempo, aging aircraft, and increases in depot scheduled downtime, we have improved fleet aircraft availability and mission-capable rates. The Air Force Reserve is postured to do its part to meet the operational and strategic demands of our nation's defense. But that mandate is not without its share of challenges. Our continued ability to maintain a sustainable force with sufficient operational capability is predicated on having sufficient manpower and resources. The work of this committee is key to ensuring reserve component readiness, and the National Guard and Reserve Equipment Account is our means for preserving combat capability. It guarantees that our equipment is relevant and allows for upgrades to be fielded in a timely manner. Current levels of NGRIA and supplemental funding have allowed the Air Force Reserve to make significant strides in meeting urgent warfighter requirements. Air Force Reserve NGRIA funding of at least $100 million per year will provide parity with the regular Air Force and Air National Guard and greatly enhance our readiness. As exemplified by our contribution to the joint fight, our nation relies on our capabilities. Properly equipping the reserve components will ensure the nation continues to have a force in reserve to meet existing and future challenges. In a time of constrained budgets and higher cost, in-depth analysis is required to effectively prioritize our needs, but we must all appreciate the vital role the reserve components play in supporting our nation's defense and concentrate our resources in areas that will give us the most return on that investment. I thank you again for asking me here today to discuss these important issues affecting our airmen, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you for your testimony. General Wyatt.
Chairman Bartlett and Mr. Reyes, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. I also want to thank the committee for the extraordinary support that you have given America's Air National Guard Airmen, some 106,700 strong. I'd like to open with a brief review of our activities in 2010 before turning to the future of the Air National Guard. I think it's clear that your Guard Airmen continue to make significant contributions to the nation's defense both here at home and abroad. Last year, Air Guard Airmen filled 52,372 requests for manpower, and 89% of these requests were filled by volunteers. 48,538 served in Federal or Title X status, primarily overseas, and while most of those served in Iraq and Afghanistan and the surrounding areas, Air Guard members also served in Central and South America, Asia, Europe, Africa, and Antarctica. And the Guard Airmen serving in harm's way are not just flying airplanes and supporting flight operations. In fact, the greatest demand may be in the areas of security forces, intelligence, computer support, and vehicle maintenance. Today, Air Guard members are providing aerial refueling, airlift, and command and control support to relief efforts in Japan and Operation Odyssey Dawn in Libya, where we have 9 states working in conjunction with Air Force Reserve Command and active duty airmen to provide aerial refueling capability in the region. Domestically, your Guard Airmen are helping with the Southwest Border Security, the counter-drug program, and guarding the skies above our nation, flying the Air Sovereignty Alert mission. In addition, Guard Airmen almost daily are in our communities protecting property and saving lives. Guard combat search and rescue personnel in Alaska and California and New York are frequently called upon to help search for lost hikers or rescue stranded climbers. Got a report yesterday of 2 mountain climbers in Alaska that were pulled off an 11,000-foot peak by Air National Guard rescue helicopters. The Air National Guard modular aerial firefighting units have supported the Forestry Service in numerous missions, and Guard Airmen also made significant contributions to the earthquake relief in Haiti, oil cleanup in the Gulf, floods and tornadoes in the Midwest, and we are entering the hurricane season where the Guard will be present again. Every day somewhere in America there are Air Guard members supporting civil authorities and protecting our citizens. As we prepare for the future, the Air National Guard wants to build upon the lessons of the past. Former Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird introduced the Total Force Policy. When he did that, his objective was to maintain defense capability in an era of decreasing budgets, kind of like we're in today. We in the Air Guard believe the policy has proven valid. The reserve components are the solution, not the problem. Properly managed and resourced, the Air National Guard, as well as the other reserve components, can provide combat-ready and combat-relevant capability at lower cost to the taxpayer. Combat-ready in that the Air National Guard has proven its ability and willingness to respond quickly to the nation's call. Again, referring to Odyssey Dawn, we had over 150 airmen in theater in less than 24 hours. And as far as combat relevancy, given adequate equipment and funding, the Air National Guard will integrate seamlessly into the joint warfight at any point along the spectrum of conflict. There are many factors that produce the cost-effectiveness of the Air National Guard, and the most obvious is the part-time nature of our workforce. When not performing their national security mission, training, or preparing, about 70% of our Guard airmen are not being paid with taxpayer dollars. They pay their mortgages, car payments, and children's tuitions with paychecks from their civilian jobs. But the cost-effectiveness of the workforce also includes different medical plans and retirement systems at less cost to the government. And we don't move Guard families from base to base every few years. Our Guard airmen also optimize the use of correspondence courses and distance learning for their professional military education and training, cutting down on TDY and travel expenses significantly. The other major component of Air National Guard cost-effectiveness is related to our community basing. The fact that most Air National Guard units are not located on large military installations with all their supporting infrastructure, but at civilian airports or within business communities. For less than a $4 million a year investment per year in airport joint use agreement fees, we gain access to 64 commercial airports. Or put another way, the Air National Guard operates 64 community bases for the approximate cost of operating one Shaw Air Force Base. Community basing means much more than just an extraordinary tooth-to-tail ratio. It means a U.S. Air Force presence in 54 states and territories. That provides a recruiting base for all of the military services and an invaluable connection between the military and the civilian community it serves. Finally, when you have a group of airmen who have grown up in a local community, work in the local community, go to church and school in that community, they build lifelong relationships with their neighbors and civic leaders, relationships that are invaluable when dealing with an emergency or national disaster or when the nation must go to war. I'll tell you what my greatest concerns are for the future and what keeps me awake at night. In our rush to save infrastructure costs through consolidation, we lose sight of the intrinsic value of community basing. As we plan the recapitalization of weapons systems, the retirement of older systems to pay for more new systems, we fail to manage our most valuable asset, our people. When an Air National Guard unit moves from a flying mission to a non-flying mission, more is lost than just the aircraft. Highly experienced pilots and maintainers are no longer available for the total Air Force. Not only will the experience not be available in an emergency, but it will not be available to help season young regular Air Force airmen. And we lose that dual-use equipment we use to help our neighbors in an emergency. In conclusion, just let me say that the exceptional men and women of the Air National Guard have proven themselves ready, willing, able, and accessible for both their federal role and for their domestic civil support role. Thanks again for the opportunity to be here today. I look forward to answering any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much. General Carpenter.
Chairman Bartlett, Ranking Member Reyes, distinguished members of the subcommittee, it's my privilege and honor to be here today to represent 360,000 plus soldiers in the Army National Guard. Of those soldiers, nearly 34,700 are currently mobilized, and more than half have had combat experience. The sacrifice of these soldiers, their families, their employers, is something we not only acknowledge, but deeply appreciate. I wish to thank you for the opportunity to share relevant information on the equipment posture of the Army National Guard, and thank you for your continued support. Thanks for the congressional support, our nation has invested billions of dollars in equipment for the Army National Guard in the past 6 years. The delivery of that equipment has nearly doubled the Army National Guard equipment on hand rates for critical dual-use equipment, that is, equipment that can be used both in the homeland and overseas mission, over the past 5 years. I would be remiss if I did not point out how important NGREA and the work of this committee have been in modernizing and equipping the Guard. This year we have achieved a critical dual-use fill rate of 89%, with 76% of that equipment on hand in the units available to the governors should they need it even tonight. The Army National Guard Aviation Program for both fixed and rotary wing aircraft provided huge benefits in support of domestic and overseas operations since 9/11. Every year offers Army National Guard Aviation a new set of challenges. In FY10, fixed-wing aircraft transported emergency supplies and personnel during floods, wildfires, and other emergencies across the nation. During the recovery effort after and during Deepwater Horizon oil spill, the Army National Guard aviation crews logged 3,720 hours and moved over 16 million pounds of cargo. The Operational Support Airlift Agency provided critical combat support by transporting blood donations and wounded warriors across the United States. Fixed-wing aircraft also transported much-needed supplies and personnel to Haiti after the January 2010 earthquake. At home and abroad, these aircraft completed 11,312 missions, transported over 3.5 million pounds of cargo, and carried more than 70,000 passengers. We have seen Army aviation requirements increase in Afghanistan while remaining steady in Iraq. The result has been an increased op-tempo for Army National Guard aviation. While we have retired many of our aging aircraft and divested ourselves of the venerable Huey, we still have shortfalls in CH-47 Chinook and AH-64 Delta Apache airframes. The investments made in the Army National Guard have contributed to our transformation to an operational force. The nation will benefit from that past investment and experience in our modern Army National Guard. In a budget-constrained environment, the operational Army National Guard is a cost-effective solution. I already mentioned the importance of NGREA. Because it is critical to our equipping strategy, we have worked diligently to ensure our obligation rates this past year have met the acquisition objectives of 80% obligation rate in the year of appropriation and 90% in the second year. I am proud to report to you today that 93% of the NGREA funds for FY09 have been obligated and 84% for FY10 have been obligated well above the established goals. It is also vital that we continue to fund soldier and family outreach programs. In calendar year 2010, the number of reported Army National Guard suicides doubled, 62 in calendar year 09 compared to 113 in calendar year 10. Within the Army Guard, we have set a goal to cut that number by half, back to 60 in calendar year 2011. Most states have developed comprehensive social support and mental health initiatives, as well as what the Army has done to support our programs. These programs emerged out of a need to strengthen soldier resilience. Several of our states, including Michigan, Nevada, Nebraska, California, Wisconsin, Kansas, and Illinois, have innovative resiliency programs. Across the nation, the adjutant generals are committed and actively engaged in this effort. I credit them with the current downward trend we are experiencing and the reported number of suicides for calendar year 11. Again, I would like to acknowledge the critical role your committee has played in building and sustaining the best National Guard I've seen in my career of more than 4 decades. I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you all very much for your testimony. As is my practice, I will reserve my questions until last, hoping that they will all have been asked by other members of the subcommittee. Mr. Reyes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, for your testimony. My first question deals with the Army's current plan for equipping Army National Guard brigade combat teams, including having just one out of 6 heavy brigades equipped with the best, most modern versions of the M1 tank and the M2 Bradley. The committee received testimony earlier this year that the reason for this disparity in the equipment was due to the affordability concerns that the Army had with trying to have all Army heavy units equipped with the most modern and capable M1 tanks and M2 Bradley vehicles. The questions I have, first one is, doesn't it make sense to have our Army National Guard heavy brigades equipped with the very best versions of the M1 tanks and M2 Bradley vehicles? Over and over, the Army mantra has been, we train like we fight. And it just seems to me that not having our soldiers equipped with the same equipment that hopefully they're going to take into battle is not a good policy and doesn't make sense, again, based on what the Army says. Second, how would having the most capable M1 tanks and M2 Bradley vehicles help Army National Guard units integrate into the Army's future tactical communications network? And if the Guard doesn't have these digital platforms, could it conceivably be left out of the future Army network battlefield? General Carpenter, if you would give us your sense on these three questions.
Yes, sir. First of all, a number of years ago, the Army structured a two-variant strategy for the tanks and Bradleys inside of not just the Army National Guard, but across the Army. They have progressively modernized to the most modern version of those particular vehicles, and to this point, the Army National Guard, as you pointed out, has one heavy brigade combat team that is equipped with M1 A2 SEP tanks and the coordinated Bradley fighting vehicle that goes along with that particular variant. We have 435 tanks, read that, 6 brigade combat teams and 3 combat arms battalions that are equipped with the other version, the M1 A1 SA. To this point, both are deployable into the warfight. And the reason why the two-variant structure was adopted was because it was an affordability issue and the ability of the tanks and Brads to be produced. So we're comfortable at this point that both of those variants will be deployed if there's a requirement. With regard to the communication piece, there are enablers in both variants that allow for the digital communication with the required battlefield systems in order for us to function, in order for us to meet our obligations. Again, we adopted the 2-tank variant with the Army, and we are, at this point, we are still in that agreement. We still believe that both variants are available for deployment and will be used in time of need.
Thank you, General Carpenter. General Wyatt, as you know, the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter is facing additional development delays. The subcommittee has been informed that these delays could push back initial fielding of the Joint Strike Fighter by as much as 2 years. In response to this delay, the Air Force is starting an effort to do service life extension upgrades to some of the F-16s in its fleet. But of course, this process will be slow, with no F-16s going in for the SLEP upgrades until 2016. What is your current understanding of how the Air Force intends to modernize the F-16 squadrons in the Air National Guard? And do you think it makes sense to accelerate the SLEP program in order to ensure that the upgraded F-16s are available correspondingly at the right time?
Mr. Reyes, thank you very much for the question. Obviously, this is an area of serious concern for the Air National Guard as we fly the majority of the older Block 30 F-16s. I would say probably the best way to answer this question is with an observation at the very beginning, and then tell you what I know and don't know about the recapitalization program of the Air Force. First, I think the key to the recapitalization of the combat fighter fleet for the Air Force is to take an approach that all of the components should be concurrently resourced with the new airplanes in a balanced fashion across all 3 components, concurrently with that of the active component. We know that the recent slip in the F-35 program that you've talked about has influenced the United States Air Force to take a look at the service life extension program that you mentioned. And it is true that the Air Force is considering that. That decision, as you said, doesn't have to be made until 2016. with the current status of the F-35 program. If there were any changes to the F-35 acquisition program as it has been restructured, that might require a different look or a different time frame. But right now, the keys to the Air Force recapitalization program are about fourfold. I would say that the restructured F-35 program must stay on time, on track, and on cost would be the first one. The second would be the F-22 modernization program should be fully funded so that all of the F-22s in the fleet will have the same capabilities. Number three, if necessary, the Block 40 and 50 F-16s should see service life extensions. Again, the time would depend upon how the F-35 program goes. And then one thing that has occurred since the last time we had the opportunity to meet last year, sir, is that the Air Force has funded the structural sustainment program for the early block, the pre-block F-16s. This is significant for all of the Air National Guard Block 30 units because with this sustainment, we're able to extend the life of those airplanes 2 to 3 years. And so that's good news for all the Block 30 wing commanders and adjutants general out there. As far as what lies after, I would stress that a fully funded and all of those components I just mentioned about the recapitalization plan is key not only for Air National Guard recapitalization, but also for the United States Air Force recapitalization. It's imperative that we evaluate the program as we go along, because right now, of all the Block 30 F-16 units that are in the Air National Guard, only the Vermont unit, Burlington, Vermont unit, has been selected for the F-35, and we think that barring any further slips in the F-35 program, that will happen in the 2020 time frame, give or take a year. But the other units, even with the structural sustainment, will need to see some sort of future in their plan in the years 2020, 2021, that time frame. I'm working with the United States Air Force now to further evaluate the probable flow of Block 40 and 50 jets to the Air National Guard as the F-35 comes online and is fielded to the active component. And I hope that by the time we meet together next year or later on, that we'll have a definite number of the, not only the number of 40s and 50s that will flow to the Guard to replace our Block 30 fleet, but also the timing and the amount per year so that we can program those into our units which face loss of their F-16 Block 30s in the 2020 time frame. I hope that answers your question, sir.
It does, and I thank you for that answer. Although, Mr. Chairman, we had, as you know, Secretary Gates here yesterday, and he one of his comments was that for those that are thinking about finding ways to cut the defense budget, he would ask that we all keep in mind the many challenges that we're facing around the world. And he mentioned Japan, of course, Libya, and Afghanistan, and among many. But I also think it's important that as we travel around the world and we see the reserve and National Guard components deployed to some of these very areas, as we heard in the testimony, that the Secretary think about how we support them with updated equipment as well. And I appreciate the position you gentlemen are in order to get the information to us, and the fact that you will make do with whatever the decision is. But I just think we need to carefully look at that, because at any given moment, the National Guard and the reservists could be in the middle of the Libyan fight or deployed to Afghanistan, as they have been, and you know they were a major part of the Iraqi effort. So I have one more question, but I'll reserve it until a second round if we're able to with the votes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen.
We should have time for a second round now. Mr. Loviando.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to our distinguished panel, and thank you for your service to our country. On Wednesday, Admiral Winfield referenced Section 333 of the FY 2011 National Defense Authorization Act during an opening statement before the full committee. I offered this language with Congresswoman Gabby Giffords, and I know that this section requires him to evaluate the ASA mission in consultation with the Director of the National Guard Bureau and report back to us on various components of the mission that we outlined. I guess, General White, this probably be for you. Can you give us any insight into what we can expect to read in that report and when we can expect this report to be made available, since we asked for consultation from the Guard side?
Yes, sir, and thank you for the question. I have been in consultation with Admiral Winnefeld. Our staffs have worked very closely together. My understanding is the Admiral will be ready to release that report here very shortly. I can't tell you exactly when, but I think, in summary, what you will see, without getting into the detail until it is announced, is that the Admiral recognizes, as the commander of NORTHCOM, the importance of the Air Sovereignty Alert mission. He recognizes the growing threat that we face with the maritime threat and some of those capabilities that seem to be emerging. And I think that he will also take a look at some of the other ways, including not just Air Sovereignty Alert, but the other ways that the Department can help with ensuring the sovereign airspace of the United States of America. Congressman, as you well know, because you have one of those units in your jurisdiction, that the Air National Guard performs 16 of the 18 Air Sovereignty Alert sites across the country. I would not expect that total number to change much, if at all, because I think that with the threat that we face, there is wisdom in geographical disbursement of our forces. We're able to respond quicker that way, and it I think further points out the value of the community basing that we have. The particular unit that is in your jurisdiction, the 177th, is one of the ASA units, as you well know, and it protects one of the most heavily populated areas of the country. And if you look around the country at the other locations of our Air Sovereignty Alert sites, you can see that they protect not only our citizens but key infrastructure around the country that may come under attack. So I applaud Admiral Winnefeld for what he is doing with the report. I think it will be very informative to the United States Air Force, Department of Defense, and Congress also. I have great confidence in the work that he is doing. He is pulling together the adjutants general and our wing commanders in the Air National Guard, and I know he's working with the Army National Guard and the other reserve components too, as he looks at new and innovative ways to protect our country. I hope this answers your question, sir.
Yes, sir. I also have a follow-up and want to thank Mr. Reyes because he touched on this with a situation with the F-16, but there are additionally two areas that we specifically asked for the report to look at. Are the current ability to perform the ASA mission with respect to training, equipment, and basing, and whether or not the ASA mission is fully resourced. Could you try to give us your opinion on these two areas and offer some recommendations on how the subcommittee might be able to help you address the current and future shortfalls that you might have with specific pieces of equipment of your F-16 fleet?
Let me address the age of the fleet first, because the answer to the question is right now we're okay. We have sufficient capability to perform the Air Sovereignty Alert mission. There's been some discussion about, as we recapitalize the United States Air Force and the Air National Guard, is it necessary to bed down those units that perform the ASA with fifth-generation fighters? And I would point out that of the 16 Air Sovereignty Alert sites that are covered primarily by our Block 30 F-16s, that those same units not only do the Air Sovereignty Alert mission, but they're used in the federal warfight overseas as we rotate on Air Expeditionary Force rotations, and we count on those airplanes to perform our operations overseas in the event of war. When you think about in the future, and this goes to answer your question about proper equipping in the future, it is apparent that we will need the capabilities that reside in the fifth-generation fighter, not necessarily the stealth aspects so much, but those parts of the fifth-generation fighters, like AESA radar, like integrated communications, like fusion sensor and fusion systems that allow the air sovereignty alert birds to communicate with the other sensors that we have available around the country, and to have the comm that we need and the electronic warfare protection that the units would need when they perform the AEF rotation that they're required to do. In the last couple of years, we have made great strides in rewriting what we call the DOC statements, the description of capability statements for each of our air sovereignty alert units, so that, and we did this in conjunction with Air Combat Command and the United States Air Force, so that now there is a documented requirement, not just for the warfight overseas and the capabilities that our jets need for that, but also for the air sovereignty alert mission. So when we talk about the basing locations, I think you'll see that in the report that it comes out, and I think what you'll see is we have those pretty much right. There may be some small tweaks one way or the other. As far as the equipping, for the current time, we're okay, but I share your concern that as we age those F-16s out, that if we don't modernize them with either a SLEP or replacing them with 40 and 50 series F-16s with those AESA sensor fusion and communication capabilities, that there could be a time in the future when we would not be able to adequately protect ourselves. But I have great faith that through the recap program with either F-35s or with legacy flow of 40s and 50s, we will be able to meet that mission in the future. There is a question on the timing and when that will happen, and those are the details that I think will probably be dictated by the performance or lack thereof of the F-35 acquisition program.
Well, again, thank you, Mr. Chairman. General, thank you. I hear what you're saying. Cautiously optimistic that this timing works out, but boy, if it doesn't, we're in a heap of hot water. We're in a heap of hot water. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Kritz.
Well, that's the problem about being way up front. You can't see who's behind you. But thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, Generals, for being here. My first question goes to you, General Carpenter, and it sort of plays along with what Mr. Reyes was saying or asking earlier, is that with the two fleet or two variant in the Abrams, you know, I think I'm looking through the presidential procurement budgets for the last about 6-7 years, and it seems that about in the mid part of the decade is when everyone realized that we better start funding procurement for the reservists and the Guard so that you could train well. And in Pennsylvania, where I'm from, we have quite a lot of Guard and Reserve that not only are in the state right now, but have served in pretty much any activity that we've had. And I'm curious that when you're planning, and you have, and we have actually AH-64Ds in my congressional district, so they're training on what's being used in theater. And what does it add to the training of our Guardsmen when they're training on the Abrams that aren't the ones being used in the field, or the AH-64s, if they're training on ones that don't match what they have to use in the field? What does that do to your training?
Well, sir, obviously, when they're training on a model that they're not going to fight with, that they're not going to deploy with, there is some gap there that you have to train up before you can deploy or before you can be integrated into the rest of the force on the ground in the theater. Right now, as I mentioned to Mr. Reyes, the 2 tank variant and 2 Bradley variant fleet are interoperable. And so what we have been assured by the Army is that they will be deployable. Now, I don't think that we should fool ourselves and say that they're going to deploy the older, less capable model first. They're going to deploy the most capable, obviously, into the theater. And so we are confident that if that happens, they'll become part of what we call a theater-provided equipment. And at that point, you know, we will rotate soldiers and units in on top of that fleet, which is what we're doing in Afghanistan right now. Right. The AH-64D is a different issue. We are not deploying the A models into any theater at this point.
Right.
And so we're in the midst of a conversion of all of our A models into Delta models. We have 3 battalions left to go, and right now we're looking forward to having all of those equipped with the AH-64 Delta models. Part and parcel to that is the high demand for those kinds of helicopters in theater in Afghanistan, and we're seeing that requirement rise as opposed to going down. So we're pretty confident that those helicopters are going to be fielded and those crews and those units are going to be used when required in that particular rotation.
I appreciate that, and that's, my concern is that we have, and especially when you're talking about our Guard and Reserve, when they live in the community and they're getting deployed and they're training up, and then they're not necessarily always going to be deployed as a unit. They're going to be attached to other units and then have to train up or have to be equipped and trained. So it's just one of those concerns that as I look at the production schedule for really 3 of our ground vehicles, Abrams, Bradley, and Stryker, you see that the Abrams goes to 0 in FY14. They're not going to make any more Abrams tanks and then ramp up again a couple years later. Bradley stops FY15. They stop producing Bradleys. And the Stryker, there's going to be a gap starting FY14. And having lived in a state where Guard and Reserve play such a large role, always want to make sure that our Guardsmen and Reservists are equipped and trained so that when they go to theater they're effective and there's not a lag time that has to be covered. So I appreciate that answer. It's still a concern because certainly I think there's an opportunity to continue the Abrams production and upgrade them all to the M1A2. One thing that came to light, I have a very good friend who's an Army aviator who talks fondly of the Sherpa. And we see the Sherpa mission being moved from the Army to the Air Force, and I'm wondering how that affects the Guard and the Reserve. And because when the Guard, and this is the way I see it, is when the Guard, especially the Guard, when they have it, you own those vehicles, and it's like having your kid with your car. You take care of it, you keep it clean, and you keep it operational. And I'm wondering what that impacts in your operational opportunity.
Sir, there are 17 states across the nation that have Sherpas. There are 42 total airplanes. There are about 500 aviators and crew chiefs that are involved in that particular mission across 17 states. We have been directed, courtesy of the Resource Management Decision, RMD, to begin parking those aircraft, divesting ourselves of those aircraft starting in this year. We will park 4 of these airplanes this year, and by FY15 we will totally divest ourselves of those particular aircraft. We are concerned about the future of the aviation community that makes up the C-23s right now, and we're making plans for them to transition prospectively into rotary wing aviation or perhaps transition to being part of the C-27 crews that are involved with the Air National Guard. Our concern from a Homeland Defense perspective, though, is that these aircraft shoulder the bulk of the cargo and passenger capacity inside of the country. Specifically, the Deep Horizon disaster that we saw, oil well in the Gulf, much of what was done down there in the fixed wing world was done by the C-23s. We think that there's a gap that we need to be concerned about between when we start the divestiture and when the C-27s come online in full capacity and in enough quantity to take up that responsibility. And we're working with the Army at this point to figure out how to resolve that issue.
Well, thank you. I do have another question, but I'll yield back so that some other folks can get their questions in. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Runyon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Generals, thanks for coming out. As you may or may not know, I have the honor to represent Joint Base McGuire-Dix-Lakehurst, so one of the predominant Reserve National Guard bases in the country. But talking, we always talk about 15, 20 years down the road a lot. I want to just touch on, what are your top equipment, General Wyatt, what are your top equipment priorities now and really your shortfalls in the FY12 budget as we currently sit here?
The Air National Guard, like most of the reserve components, relies heavily on the NGRIA accounts to make sure that the equipment that we do have is modernized. We, as far as the fill rates go, we're okay on the fill rates, the numbers of specialized equipment that we have, but our stuff is old, and the cost of maintaining and repairing and making sure that it is serviceable and ready to go to fight increases all the time. And that's why this recapitalization is such a big issue to the Air National Guard. And it's not just the fighter fleet. I'm talking about the tankers. We have a source selection with the KC-46A. And again, I think the smart thing to do as we decide where these airplanes will be located is to field this airplane concurrently across all of the components at the same time as the active component, and to make sure that we do that in a balanced fashion across all of the components. That way, General Stenner's force, my force, can relieve the operations tempo of the active component. We will remain operational. And the days of having strictly a strategic reserve and strictly an operational force are unaffordable. We have to have an operational force across all three components, and the depth that the Guard and the Reserve bring allows us to have that strategic reserve. But we've got to be trained on the same equipment with the same capabilities to be able to offer the country what it needs for the dollars. Specifically, I would say as we go through and take a look at the things that we need to improve on the older airframes that we have now. I talked a little bit about AESA radars. In the past, the requirement for Air National Guard recapitalization of AESA radars for our fighter fleet has fallen below the funding line of the United States Air Force. I don't see any funding for that in the future, although there could be, as the Air Force may or may not enter into that SLEP process that I talked about, the Service Life Extension Program for some of the 40s and 50s. But we have been able to acquire some AESA radars for some of our F-15 fleet, thanks to the interest of congressional members who in the past have, through congressional ads, funded some of that. That may or may not be available as we go. I'm very aware of the debate that's going on about congressional ads. So that, in my mind, makes the criticality of the NGRIA account even more important, because we have not used the NGRIA account in the past to do AESA radars, but we will certainly need to take a look at that as the only funding source now for recapitalization of our fleet. On the large airplane part, I would submit that we need to take a look at large aircraft infrared and countermeasures, LAIRCM, for some of our larger airplanes. We need to make sure that the Air National Guard C-130 fleet, we fly primarily the H models. We have only 2 wings of J models, and that's 16 airplanes. All the rest are H2s, 3s, and those airplanes need to see the AMP, the Avionics Modernization Program, funded so that those aircraft can operate in conjunction with the newer United States Air Force J models. We need to take a look eventually at recapitalizing that older H fleet with Js. As far as the combat services part, Agile Combat Services part, we can always improve the rolling fleet, the stock of equipment that we have that supports the flyers. A lot of our equipment is extremely old there, and while our fill rate right now is about 88%, the equipment that we have, again, is old, and our weapons sustainment as far as the rolling stock and some of the support equipment that we have will continue to slide in the out years because it's getting too old, too expensive to maintain, and the dollars just simply aren't there to keep that serviceable fill rate up at 88%. I expect a 2 to 3% degrade in that capability as we go out in the future. So those are the areas that I would concentrate on.
Well, thank you. Just a quick question for General Carpenter. What is this, the status of the payback plans the Army is required to provide your reserve components with their equipment?
Sir, the program you refer to is 1225.6 program, which essentially requires that if equipment is transferred from the Guard or Reserve to the active component, there's a payback plan required. We've learned a lot since we left equipment in theater in 2004, 2005. Much of the most modern equipment we had in the National Guard was left in theater for follow-on units to utilize in the warfight. That payback plan is in place, and we are in the midst of receiving the payback right now from the Army in terms of funding the equipment systems that we left behind there. What's going on right now in terms of the way we handle that is when we leave a set of equipment in theater, in Afghanistan, for instance, there is a payback plan put in place immediately. And so the Army and the Army National Guard and the Reserve component have learned a lot about this process in terms of ensuring that the equipping levels inside of the three components of the Army remain the same. And so I'm very confident that the payback plans that we've seen at this point are going to be honored, and that we've got a adequate, stable plan for us to go into the future with.
It's good to hear. Thank you very much. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Mrs. Hartzler.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you know, I just arrived, so I apologize if you have already addressed this, but as the daughter of an Army Reservist, I'm proud to be here and appreciate all of you and the important role you played and are continuing to play as you are now more operational in your scope, and in some ways that's concerning, but they have risen to the challenge, and I appreciate what all the families are doing in support of that. Of course, I'd like to see the dwell time increased for the time that they're at home, and I know it's very stressful and hard on the families, and so appreciate all that you're doing. Just a question, I guess, I have for General Wyatt regarding the Air Force. And I've heard that the fighter aircraft is reducing its amount of aircraft from 2,200 in 2008 to now there's 2,000 in 2010. How will that reduction of 200 aircraft affect the Air National Guard's ability to perform mission?
Ma'am, thanks for the question. You're correct. The Quadrennial Defense Review and the National Defense Strategy has helped the Air Force determine the requirements for the Combat Air Force fleet. And you're right, the correct number to meet those requirements is 2,000 total aircraft inventory with 1,200 what we call primary assigned aircraft inventory. We got to that 2,000 number with the CAF redux that we've just worked our way through. The Air National Guard did lose some of its fighter fleet, as did the other components also. But right now we're pretty steady at that 2,000 number. The President's 12 budget has announced the loss of 18 more F-16s to the Air National Guard, and so we're beginning to drop below that 2,000 number. I think it's critical to watch that 2,000 number and the 1,200 number, because that is a moderate risk way to meet the requirements of QDR. So I would submit that anything that drops below moderate risk when it comes to the security of this country needs to be examined closely. Whether we can retain numbers close to that 2,000 and 1,200 depend upon a lot of variable factors that I've mentioned before, whether or not the F-35 stays on its restructured acquisition schedule, and if not, the Air Force mitigation actions that may follow, such as service life extension programs for a number of its Block 40 and 50 F-16s. Right now, the Air Force is looking at 300. That's a decision that doesn't have to be made at this point until we see what the F-35 does, but the time for that decision is coming, and we'll have to make a decision one way or the other here pretty quickly. But we have worked our way in the Air National Guard through the CAF redux to the point now where most of our units are settled. They know what the results of the CAF redux are. We will continue in through FY12 to comply with CAF redux. We'll transfer some F-15s from Great Falls, Montana to Fresno in California. There is a follow-on mission in the C-27 world for the unit in Great Falls, so that's a good news story. But right now we're okay, but our ability to field that 2,000 and do the mission will depend upon all that part of the Air Force's recapitalization plan maturing, taking place, and being adequately funded to make sure that we don't drop below that 2,000 number that you've mentioned before.
Very good. Well, I just want to make sure that our men and women have the equipment that they need, and I'm always concerned when there's reduction. It seems like we have a need for more equipment in a lot of areas, and so appreciate what you're doing. So thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Mr. Reyes, you had another question.
Yes, I did, and I just wanted to make sure that we understood it for the record. When we were talking about the current Guard and Reserve force structure, was this an issue because is there some kind of risk in terms of the in strength? And are there ongoing internal Army discussions about either about changes to the size or the content of the Army National Guard or Army Reserve?
So far, sir, from the discussions I've been involved in, nobody has talked to me about reducing the size of the Army Reserve. I know that the message from the Secretary of Defense was taking the active Army in strength down to 520, which is 27,000. I think, just as the Chairman said in his opening remarks, the return on investment we're getting from our reserve components in terms of what it costs versus what we're getting. Today, I keep 25,000 to 30,000 Army Reserve soldiers on active duty continuously. About 20,000 to 25,000 of those are in Iraq, Afghanistan, 20 other countries around the world. Ethiopia, Uganda, Tanzania, places like that, doing a lot of stability operations in addition to warfighting operations. I keep 6,000 to 7,000 on active duty back here in the United States. They're filling the training bases. They're the drill sergeants that are training our force, not the reserve, the active force. They're a lot of the doctors and nurses in our hospitals on our installations at Fort Sam Houston or Walter Reed. And the value for that, for what we're paying, is enormous when you look at what % of the budget we account for. So I think what the discussion is going to, we need to be looking at is if we are forced because of cost, budgeting, and whatever to reduce the size of our active force, we cannot afford to reduce the size of our reserve. In fact, we may need to look the other direction.
Right.
Because today we have constructed, in the Army Reserve, I make up the combat support force, the enablers we like to call them. But if you look at how we've structured our Army today, between General Carpenter and myself with the Guard and Reserve, we account for 75% of the Army's medical capability, 75% of the Army's engineer capability, 80% of the Army's transportation capability, 85% of the Army's civil affairs capability. And you could go on and on with that with the military police and other capabilities. We cannot afford, one, not to have an operational reserve. Secondly, we cannot afford to look at reducing any end strength in the reserve. That's my feeling.
Sir, as General Stoltz mentioned, there have been no discussions that I've been a part of in terms of changing the size of either the Guard Reserve with regard to the current initiative to reduce the size of the active component. There are some initiatives in terms of what we call ACRC rebalance, in terms of what type of structure there is in the Guard and what type there is in the Reserve and what type there are in the active component. But we just went through what I would call a wholesale transformation to modularity here in the last 5 or 6 years. And for us in the Guard and Reserve, what builds readiness is stability. Because when you reorganize a unit or when you stand up a new unit, and you're well aware of this, sir, it takes about 4 or 5 years to get to the readiness that you need to be able to deploy that unit. And we, between General Stoltz and I, we have been very emphatic with the leadership of the Army that stability does build readiness, and if you're going to reorganize, let's be very thoughtful about how we do that. But, sir, there have been no discussions about changing the size of the Guard and Reserve inside of the Army that I know of.
Good. Well, I'm glad I asked the question. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Kritz, you had another question.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just as one quick follow-up on the training and the Abrams and the AH-64s. If you had your druthers, does it make more sense to have the same vehicles in the Guard and Reserve that they're using in the field so that as you're training, you can directly deploy? You don't have to go through another step.
Yes, sir. The obvious question to that is yes. But understanding that we are operating in a budget-constrained environment and that there are some limitations on what we can do and what the possibilities are here in terms of fielding equipment, when you take that into consideration, long-term, yes, we want to get to a single variant. Right. But for the time being, the Army has remained fully committed to modernizing the Army National Guard. And I think, as I mentioned in my opening statement, we are seeing more modern equipment come to the Army National Guard than we have ever seen in the history of the organization, as far as I know. AH-64 Deltas, as we talked about before, it's a big deal. We took over a year to do the conversion, mobilizing, and deployment of the first one of these units in Arizona. And it was a Herculean effort, and to the credit of the Arizona Guard and the mobilization base inside of First Army, we did transition from the A model to the Delta model. But it took a long time to get there. And so, to your point, sir, I think the issue is that there is a gap there, and it does take some time to transition when there is a call.
Okay. Well, and the reason I circled back around to that is because I think a lot of the modernization is because Congress put in the money for the Guard and Reserve to be equipped at a higher rate. My question, though, is really because there's a lot of Guard and Reserve in Pennsylvania, and we know when a lot of your folks are being deployed at a much higher rate than anyone ever expected over this last decade, that when they go back home, they sort of scatter to the wind. And I saw some talk about suicides, and I saw some talk about mental health issues. And I'm just wondering, are you being given the resources, and how is your plan working to make sure that our men and women, when they do return, are being taken care of in the field? And that's for any or all of you, actually.
First of all, sir, back to the equipment issue, Pennsylvania has the only Stryker brigade inside of the Army National Guard, and to that 56th Stryker Brigade credit, they deployed downrange, and the accolades at that particular unit, and frankly the awards that they got when they got back, were truly inspiring, because this was a unit that we built from scratch and that Pennsylvania manned and that they deployed, and they just did great work in theater. And I think Pennsylvania and the Army National Guard can take a lot of pride in that effort for those soldiers. Suicides are a problem for us, and frankly, we're trying to get our arms around exactly, what is the cause. First of all, we need to gather the statistics and identify what is the demographic that we see that is inclined to do this. And for us in the Army National Guard, what we see is 60% of the people who commit suicide have never been deployed. And so it's not necessarily a deployment issue. Only about 15–20% are unemployed or have money problems. The common theme that we see across the 113 suicides we saw in 2010 was that they are predominantly white, they're predominantly male, and they're predominantly young. And so we've got a lot of those kinds of people inside of the Army National Guard, courtesy of the combat organizations that you talked about. Plus, we recruit from the communities. We're a community-based organization, and a lot of our young soldiers join while they're still in high school, and some shortly after they get out of high school. And what we find is that that cohort is not quite as resilient as their predecessors, as your generation or my generation. When we have some adversity, we just work through it. But that resilience doesn't necessarily find itself inside of the current soldiers we recruit to. And so the Army, in conjunction with the Army National Guard, has taken on a comprehensive soldier fitness program designed to build resiliency inside of the soldiers that we're recruiting into our organization. We are putting the money that we have against the initiatives that we've got out there to try and solve this problem. Probably the gap that we have right now is trying to figure out how to provide behavioral health to soldiers who've never been deployed. If you've been deployed, you have eligibility for VA benefits, those kinds of things. If you've never been deployed, probably the safety net is TRICARE Reserve Select. And the cost for an individual soldier is somewhere around $50 or $60 monthly. Doesn't seem like a lot to us, but for the most part, it's for a soldier who only gets a couple $100 for a drill weekend, that's a significant part of that paycheck. But we are encouraging soldiers to participate in that, and we are working through the states to provide behavioral health support to the soldiers once we identify the ones who are struggling with those kinds of problems.
Sir, on behalf of the Air National Guard, similar concerns on suicide. Last year, 2010, and these are tracked on a calendar year basis, not fiscal year basis, the Air National Guard suffered 19 suicides, surpassing the 17 that we saw many, many years ago. Along the same lines of the Army National Guard, the causation, if there is such a thing, related to economics, inability to make mortgage payments, loss of job, personal relationships, and not necessarily with deployments overseas. We've seen last year the Air Force increase its budget by about 25% for mental health professionals to help with the force. We're working with the United States Air Force at the present time to see if we can avail ourselves of some of that increase in their funding for mental health. But absent that, we have taken steps this year to lean forward and hire mental health professionals at each of our 89 air wings across the 54 jurisdictions. The wing in the Air National Guard is really the focus point. And we are attempting to put a mental health professional at each of the wings that would be available to administer not only to those who have deployed, but also to those who have not deployed, and to work with our adjutants general and our wing commanders to make sure that we don't wait on the phone call to come, that we take proactive action before when we see something developing that is not quite right. The key is putting eyes on those individuals. We're about two-thirds of the way through fielding that, and we've taken that money out of our own Air National Guard budget, and we've also have a big chunk of that cost that we have used yellow ribbon reintegration money to help fund. And so far, knock on wood, it's paying dividends. At this time in 2010, we had 6 suicides. To date now, we have 2. We hope that the effort that we're putting, not just through the money part of it, but also encouraging through other programs that we work in conjunction with the United States Air Force, the program like the Wingman program, the ACE program, and some of the other programs that we have that helps focus on our individuals. We're able to make those personal contacts through those wing health professionals, through our chaplain corps, through our JAG corps, and we find that we are now saving more individuals or preventing more suicides than are actually occurring. So these are starting to make and pay dividends for us.
I will just echo the comments that General Wyatt just made and tell you that the Wingman program itself, it depends on leadership. And a lot of what we're doing right now is in fact a leadership issue, where we are emphasizing on those Wingman Day programs the fact that we as leaders and then as friends and co-workers need to look each other in the eye and say, if there's an issue, you got to tell me about it, and there's got to be no stigma attached to that. Whether you are asking the question and it's an embarrassing moment, or whether you are responding to that with, I do have an issue and I do solicit some help. That, I believe strongly, that leadership emphasis on that has led to those saves that we are now starting to see and can accommodate these folks and translate what we did to save that person to the next individual that comes along and articulates an issue. So I believe we are both reducing the suicide rate and starting to identify the saves and what it took to do that, and incorporating those in the training programs as well as the educational and the mental health pieces that we've got along that line as well.
I'll just add two quick comments, because everything that the others have said applies to us. Our suicides are not occurring predominantly because of deployment stress or anything else. It's something else going on in that soldier's life. And the two focus areas that I have really put my leadership against, one, you got to figure out what's going on in the soldier's head from the start. To the point where I've said, you know, our recruiters ought to be counselors. When somebody walks in a recruiting station and says, I want to join the Army, instead of saying, can you pass a drug test, can you pass a physical, first question ought to be, why? What's going on in your life that makes you want to join the Army? And if he talks about not having a job, having a broken marriage, something, then a red flag goes up. We're not your solution. Because I think a lot of soldiers come to us looking for help. There's something else going on in their life, and they're looking for us to fix it. So we got to figure out what's going on in their life. And secondly, for the reserve component, unlike the Army that went after a battle buddy strategy, so if you see your buddy in the motor pool and he's acting strange or whatever, you got to reach out and help. Our battle buddies are our families, because we only see our soldiers 2 days out of the month. And so any suicide training about reducing stigma, about asking for help, has to include the family. You've got to educate and bring the family in. Otherwise, you're going to miss it, because they don't commit suicide at the drill hall. They commit suicide back home when their family's there. And so we're stressing, get to know what's going on in the soldier's mind from the beginning, and secondly, get the family involved and get them as part of that training program.
Well, thank you very much, and believe me, I have tremendous respect for the Guard and Reserve, because this last decade really stressed your forces, and this is really what makes America great. So thank you very much for your testimony. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. I appreciate this question and your answers on suicide. I have been concerned about suicide rates in our forces, and particularly concerned about suicide rates and increasing homelessness in our veterans. I don't want us to mirror the Vietnam era, and I'm very pleased that you all are very aggressively addressing this in the forces, and I hope that we can be more successful than we have been in that transition from active duty to retirement, when the VA takes over and somehow a lot of our young people drop through the cracks. And there are a lot of civilian organizations out there that want to help, and we're working very hard to make sure that there's an opportunity for them to do that. This has been a very good hearing. Fortunately, as I had hoped, my colleagues asked essentially all of the questions that I would have asked. There are a couple of tangential questions that we will submit for the record, if you would. As I was sitting here listening to the questions and the testimony, I was reminded that a week or so ago I went to the deployment of one of our Guard units. This was a pretty emotional experience for me, and I there was once again reminded how much we owe you and your people. I was talking to the company commander, and about 20 feet from him was a very attractive young lady with about an 18-year-old boy in her arms. The boy was reaching out toward the company commander and crying. And he says, oh, he's annoyed that I'm ignoring him. And so we went over and picked up the little boy from his mother's arms, and then he told me that his wife was 6 months pregnant. She's going to have another boy, and they've already named that boy. And I thought, he's going to return in a year, and he's going to Egypt. And when he comes back, his son is going to have to be reintroduced to his father. And he's going to see a new son, 9 months old, that he's never seen before. And then after the assembly and they were saying their goodbyes to each other, I was impressed with how these young couples and their very emotional goodbyes could ignore all the other people around them. They were in a world of their own as they were saying those last goodbyes before that year's departure. And I was reminded again how much we owe you. Thank you very much for your leadership please thank all of the people out there in your commands that are doing so much for our country. This has been a very good hearing. Thank you for your testimony. Panel members, thank you for your questions. We'll now be adjourned.